Hi, this is Greg Salmieri of the Salem Center at the University of Texas, Austin. And joining me is Mike Mazza of the Ayn Rand Institute. And this is the first experimental episode of Check Your Premises, which is going to be, not Check Your Premises, even more experimental. It's an old name for something else. The first experimental episode of Choose Your Issues, which is going to be a new podcast of our Objectivism program here at the Salem Center. The premise, why don't we bring that up in conversation? Hi, Mike. Nice to have you here.
Good to be here.
And welcome to Austin.
Thank you.
We've got also some assembled friends and ne'er-do-wells who might join us on screen and mic later if we want to test how the other mic works and if they want to say anything.
Well, Greg, why don't we start by talking about what the program at the Salem Center is and how you see the podcast fitting into it.
Thanks. Yeah. So maybe for people who don't know, I should say even what the center is. So the Salem Center is a sort of think tank or home for heterodox thought on campus, thought that goes a little bit against the academic mainstream. And there are a diversity of different views represented, but the kind of common denominator running among them is support for free markets, valuing of economic freedom, and the tremendous prosperity that it's brought about over the past 2 centuries around the world to the extent that it's been implemented. And I've been here for 2 years now as part of the program, and I'm an objectivist, so objectivism is thereby one stream of content that's been represented in our programming, but it's one stream and it's sort of diffuse how it comes up.
Mm-hmm.
And we now have a real concentration of people knowledgeable about and interested in objectivism, that is Ayn Rand's philosophy, here in Austin. On campus, in addition to me, there's Tara Smith in the philosophy department, who's been here long before I was, and now Gina Gorlin in the psychology department, and several of ARI's intellectuals, you and Ben Bayer, who was meant to be with us tonight but is ill, are here, and then just business people, entrepreneurs, friends. There's a real kind of community of interest on campus or 1 degree away from the campus. Mm-hmm. And we thought it would be good to have a kind of channel of content that's coming out of that community, discussions among people in that community, and centered around thinking about Rand's philosophy and applying it to present-day issues, and really taking advantage of the fact that there are, people with expertise and interest in this all in one place. So what we're trying to do is make a kind of podcast that'll be live in person with people there. We're in a classroom now. We just have a few of us because we knew this one was going to be unsteady going. We're starting an hour after we planned because of some technical difficulties. Yeah, by the seat of our pants. But the idea is to get it down to something that we can pull off quickly and easily, have all the technology there, and just get a group of people into a room and start talking. And we'll have topics and, in some cases, readings planned. But the podcast will be very much a discussion with some of the people who are on campus, some people who are passing through. We have one friend visiting town today who's here with us, and students and other people from the local community to, that's what we're trying to do from a kind of technical perspective. And from a topics perspective, the idea is to have a discussion-based podcast where we're talking about objectivism, which is a philosophical system, as applied to current events, or another way to think about it, how current and cultural issues can be understood using objectivism as a lens to think about it. And I think you need abstract principles, you need philosophy to make sense of and to understand the events of your life, the events of the world. But also you come to be better to how you understand the philosophy and also evaluate it is by seeing how it applies to events in the world, not just thinking of it in the abstract away from everything. So I think to have an occasion to kind of think about, digest this philosophical system through talking about what's going on in our lives and in the world, and vice versa, to understand the world, most importantly, better, and use this as a tool for that. So that's the idea. And the idea is to do it in conversation with friends and hopefully a growing community of people around this.
Okay. So the name of the podcast, Choose Your Issues, is there any
Is that the name? I seem to be going
I
back
think
and forth.
I think so. I think Check Your Premises was a blog of yours at one point.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
they're both Ayn Rand kind of
Kind
quotes
of,
and things
yeah.
she used as titles. So. Choose Your Issues is the name of the first essay in her newsletter published in 1962, where she talked about her approach to political and cultural analysis and kind of situated her philosophy relative to some of the trends in the world at the time, and talked about the importance of um, choosing the issues that one's going to address and the framework for thinking about them. So that's where we're taking our title from. Uh, but you, as a what
Yes.
are you,
Well,
associate at the Ayn Rand Institute now? What's your title?
associate fellow. So
Associate fellow.
associate fellow.
So
That's right.
I think it's fair for me to
I'm
throw it over to
associated.
you to
Yeah.
tell us a bit about the article.
Well, so the article I couldn't, when I looked at it this afternoon, forgotten. It's 60 years old. Is surprisingly old to, I don't know, to me. When I read it was first time I read it was 20 years ago, and it
It was 40 years
40
old.
years ago. It didn't seem that old to me, but now it's more of a historical
It's almost
artifact.
eligible for Social Security.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So it's the first article in the first edition, or the first issue of her first newsletter.
A lot of
So
firsts.
yeah, a lot of firsts. So it kind of, I guess, it sets an approach or agenda for the subsequent writing in those periodicals, and the title is "Choose Your Issues." So she contrasts what she's advocating with the way she sees some conservative-ish market anti-statist figures in the culture approaching advocacy and issues they talk about. So she accuses these other counterculture figures of being reactive. So the issues that are being discussed in the culture are chosen by, she says, statists. I guess we'll talk about who's choosing the issues today, whether we'd still call them statists or whether all sides are statists or what. But those people are choosing the issues, and it's the conservatives, the anti-statists who are going along with them in a reactionary way. This is what's being discussed, and we have to take up an oppositional position. And her complaint about this is that, given that this newsletter she's writing for is going to be an objectivist newsletter, she says, well, objectivism is a philosophy. According to this philosophy, politics is kind of a derivative downstream effect of deeper positions and values. She puts it as it's downstream from culture. Political issues are downstream from cultural issues. So what she's advocating is that the issues radicals for capitalism discuss should be ones they choose based on what's philosophically significant, not what's being discussed.
And that's her phrase, radicals for capitalism, that she's using to describe herself and people who are ideologically aligned with her. And she's eager in this piece to differentiate her view from conservatism, but in a particular way that I think is different than how she would be later. I think it's somewhat a sign of those times. So in the kind of 40s, 50s, there were a lot of people who called themselves conservatives who were still against the New Deal, particularly in the 40s, as Rand was. Starting with Eisenhower, the Republican Party made its peace with the New Deal. They weren't going to try to fight back against it. They were going to try to get some of, there were other issues on which they were going to be more anti-socialist than the Democrats were, and less in favor of an expanded welfare state, or try to push back a little bit on the welfare state. But they made their peace with the kind of big welfare state measures that that were put in place under FDR. And at that time, a lot of the more radical defenders of free markets stopped calling themselves conservatives. Von Mises and Hazlitt and so forth started calling themselves libertarians at that time, and Rand never adopted that term. And later, when its meaning kind of froze, settled on something specific, she rejected it pretty strenuously. But the point was, she's not a conservative. What is she? And what are the conservatives at this time? And her view was the conservatives that represented by Eisenhower, later Nixon, the Republican Party, were kind of nothings. They didn't really stand for anything in particular. They were just kind of mealy-mouthed. They didn't want to go as far as the Democrats towards an expanded welfare state, but they didn't have anything positive to offer as an alternative. And so she was trying to think about what is the alternative, and also how should we understand what's going on in the news if we're not seeing ourselves as primarily either a conservative who's trying to say no, a little less welfare state, or a liberal, as it was at the time, or a leftist who's pushing for more of it. Later, I think she came to see the conservative movement as becoming a fundamentally religious movement. She was already concerned about that in the mid '60s, but
which is before the Goldwater campaign. This is before she's
yeah,
writing about, and did she write a speech for him? I think, but he didn't use it. Is that
she
right?
did.
Yeah.
So, but she also wrote letters to him, sort of warning him in the early '60s about the kind of infiltration by the professional religionists of the conservative movement, the way the communists had infiltrated the liberal movement. And by the late '70s, she thought that was a fait accompli. Her words about conservatives were harsher later. At this point, she just thinks it's a kind of nothing waiting to be taken over by something, and what it gets taken over by is religion. But yeah, she sees herself as a radical for capitalism, and she sees the kind of most important issues in the culture as the most important issues in current events as things that are happening initiated by the left, and not the things that are getting any pushback from the conservatives, or aren't central to their agenda anyway. They don't really have much of an agenda. And so she wants to kind of identify the issues that she sees as most important, what's important that's happening in the world today, what's the right way to understand it, and what should we do about it. And so in '62, what are those, from her perspective anyway?
So she chooses two issues that I remember reading this. I said I read this 20 years ago, and being surprised at these two. So the first one is FCC regulation. So there's is this around the time of the Fairness Doctrine? I think this might be before.
It's actually before that. So there's this guy,
Minnow.
Newton and Minnow.
Yeah.
Has anyone ever seen? Are people too young now to reference Gilligan's Island? Do people know Gilligan's Island?
I know it. I've seen the show. Yeah.
Yeah, it was. Did you see it?
Minnow,
No.
yeah.
See, it was this kind of really weird TV show about people who go out from L.A. on a 3-hour tour on a little boat called the SS Minnow, and somehow they get washed up on a tropical island and stranded there, and it's a sitcom on this island. It was called the SS Minnow after this guy, Newton Minnow, who was an FCC commissioner, or the FCC secretary or whatever, under Kennedy, who gave this speech about basically how TV is a vast wasteland and everything on it's awful, and we want more serious programming, and so therefore, it's kind of spoofing him to have a very frivolous show, have a reference to him on it. But
she sees this as an attack on intellectual freedom.
right. So the idea is that unless the TV stations start shaping up, and recall this is before cable, all the television stations are broadcast stations, and they're licensed by the FCC. So there's a kind of threat, unless you're putting what we, the administration, view as quality programming, maybe your licenses won't be renewed. And she sees this as a really ominous trend.
And so the other issue she mentions is antitrust, which again is it was surprising to me as a 19-year-old student to think that this is in part. I mean, I'm reading this in the early thousands, so I guess it's around after Microsoft.
Yeah, in the '90s it was a very live issue.
In the '90s it was a live
Microsoft
issue. Yeah.
breakup,
But for me at the time it was not as a young person, and I assume that from the context of the article it was a live issue of the day. She mentions some businessmen who were imprisoned on antitrust grounds, which that actually surprised me
that there was
that
prison
there's
time,
prison
yeah.
sentences for.
There was a case involving GE, and there were I don't remember all the details of the case, but yeah.
So those are the two issues she singles out, and those are both supported by the Kennedy administration and unopposed by conservatives.
Yeah, in fact, the tightening of the use of antitrust in the electric case, I think the cases had been started under the Eisenhower administration, but there was either in reality or at least a perception of it, I'm not sure, I haven't researched it enough, that the Kennedy administration, this is Robert Kennedy as the head of the Department of Justice, was sort of stepping up or anyway vigorously pursuing these leads, which again had been started by the previous administration against these companies. And what was her concern about? What's wrong with the FCC and what's wrong with antitrust?
Well, I think the FCC concern is an intellectual freedom of speech issue. So here we have government bureaucrats going to decide what is and isn't fit for public consumption, public broadcast. And on the side of antitrust, it's well. So she points out it's a attack on economic freedom, but also that it's a non-objective law, so that there's no way to know until you're prosecuted whether or not you've violated this law, and then even then it's not so much that you violated the law, but that some attorney general or commissioner
or judge,
has decided this. So there's a kind of attack on the rule of law antitrust conflicts with the rule of law the way it's.
I mean, there's generally her view is that both of these are non-objective laws. It's one, you have an administration, and maybe it'll change with the next administration, kind of giving a notice that they don't think what the television stations and radio stations are airing is in the general interest or the public interest. There's no standards to determine what that is, and they maybe will start pulling your license if you don't start airing things that they think are more in the public interest. So there's the idea that what can a television company do except try to kind of pander to what it thinks the administration wants, and then that's really dangerous for news coverage, for other kinds of things. And yes, she had this view that the antitrust laws were also totally non-objective. So her sense is that we have in the government now these set of laws which are being kind of aggressively used by the present administration that are elastic, rubbery, unclear what they mean, and gives the personnel in the executive branch a lot of unchecked power to try to wield over and dictate people's lives, both in the realm of economics, production, and in the realm of the spread of ideas. And she saw these as kind of ways in which kind of dictatorial, authoritarian kind of power could grow in the country. So that's what she was really concerned about at that time. You could generalize it to economic freedom and freedom of speech, but there are particular issues on each of those fronts that she sees as ominous trends. And you can see this first article as kind of agenda setting for the first few issues of the magazine, because what we get is series of articles on each of these issues over the first run of The Objectivist, where she's answering questions like, well, how should the airwaves work anyway? And what is free speech? And if there are airwaves, how should they be regulated such that we don't have this kind of issue of possibly someone's caprice governing it and so forth? And then what's wrong with antitrust and how should it be? So she's this is kind of laying down a marker, and then there's a kind of agenda of future articles that follow up on it. But we have our first chance to test the rest of our AV setup since we have a friend at the other mic. Hey, Shay.
Yeah, so I haven't read this article, but to me, one of the things that stands out about antitrust and Rand's view on antitrust that we haven't discussed is the mic doesn't work. Cool.
Have you got it working now?
I can just project really loud.
That's what we say in experimental podcasts. as much about seeing if we can get things working as it is talking about the ideas.
Should I try again? Am I good? Cool. Yeah. So what I was saying was, one aspect of antitrust that hasn't been discussed yet that I think is relevant today and also seems crucial to her issue is that to the extent that there is something being penalized, that it can be identified, it's something really good. It's it's for their virtues that these people are being punished, and I think they're like, if we're tying this to today, so I'm curious. As the question is, does that perspective come up in this article, or is that only in her later writing on antitrust? And how does that?
I forget if there's anything about it in Choose Your Issues.
Okay.
Definitely in the Persecuted Minority Big Business, which
Yeah.
is a talk that she gives shortly after that, and then is published in the newsletter. And there's it was published in her book on capitalism, and also in there's just an article called Antitrust, which is, I forget if it's in the second or third issue. So there she talks about it both being non-objective laws and it's penalizing people precisely for their success, which is her take on antitrust. That's a big topic for whether she's right about that. But yeah, this is not yet. I think it might be alluded to somewhere in the article, but it's not yet in focus.
Okay. But she clearly has the view already. It's just
Yeah.
not what she's focusing on.
And it's in Atlas Shrugged.
Yeah.
So it's,
Right.
yeah. Are these? I mean, part of what's interesting is there are resonances to both of these today. Less so the FCC per se, but there's the idea of there's fake news and there's fake news. And so that term gets bandied around on both sides of political aisles today. But there's the idea that we need to do something to stop the vast wasteland of ideas that are spreading online. Everyone agrees that there's in politics that there's something wrong with the way ideas are spreading on social media, it seems. And then just a way to fix this or a way to intervene that you get, Elizabeth Warren and Ted Cruz, people who really are two peas in a pod, in my view, railing against the social media companies. You get whatever that woman's name was who had some insider information from Facebook being, given this kind of celebrity treatment in congressional hearings. So there's the idea that these companies are proper targets for antitrust enforcement. You now have Biden's Khan, I think is her name, the new FTC chair, is someone who.
What's different is part of the rationale for the antitrust action is the kind of concerns that Minnow had at the time. So the at least as far as I can, not knowing the history well, they seem to be separate things for the.
Well, part of the other shoe to drop in some of her subsequent articles is that there are concerns about there are ideas being floated about using antitrust on media companies. And so whether she had that in mind already when she was writing Choose Your Issues, or whether that came into the news a few months later and so got into her articles and was a good synchronicity for her point, I'm not sure, but that comes up pretty soon. And it's definitely an idea that's already in her thinking, that you could censor media on economic grounds, because it comes up in Atlas Shrugged, the idea, if you think of, there's a famous law in the novel Atlas Shrugged that's a kind of the falling of dictatorship over the community, and one of the provisions in it is, no new products can come out, which means no new books can come out, and that's discussed as, well, it's just ink, therefore nobody can complain. We're regulating ink. But I want to so this is Rand writing in 1962. Probably none of us are experts on that year, but this is her identifying of the biggest issues, the issues one should focus on if you're kind of trying to figure out what needs to be advocated for or against at the time. And we'll see in subsequent articles she starts advocating particular policy measures, and she has, what are near-term things we could do about antitrust, and what's the deeper issues at stake, and so forth, and likewise for the FCC. But are these the two issues in 1962? Are there others? Do people think? We have hindsight, now.
Well, so using our hindsight, one thing that seems relevant is that over time the power, like we don't talk about the FCC today that in this way, and antitrust gradually reformed, and became less of a threat to business. So what relevance does that have to thinking about whether or not she was right?
That's a good question. And to what extent was pushback by her or people
By
like her
and
relevant
people
to
influenced
those
by her, yeah.
things? And maybe not just her, but people of similar
Similar thinking.
stripes on some of these issues. That's a good question. I mean, what happened with antitrust, right, is all the laws are still on the books. There were certain doctrines about how the things that she interpreted as too elastic should be interpreted that
Well, isn't part of the story there was a shift from the advocates of antitrust shifted from, well, we got to make sure there's more competition to we're more concerned about effects on consumers. So
the consumer welfare standard.
Yeah, consumer welfare standard. So if we can somehow show with accepted methods that a monopoly doesn't negatively affect consumer welfare, then who cares?
I mean, I think what happened with that case, at least, and I think it's an important element to think about in thinking about how things unfold in American culture, or how they have unfolded, is there was in the legal profession a lot of people uncomfortable with vagueness, with too much elasticity in the law, with terms that were ill-defined. And so you have sets of precedents that are developed that are trying to constrain the law. And so if you agree with the kind of analysis that she and others, there's a book by Fleming, I think it's called 10,000 Commandments about antitrust. There are people making this case that these laws are kind of capricious and unfollowable, and if you, depending on how you interpret them, almost anything you do, if you have a large share of the market,
If you
is
cut prices, this is anti-competitive. If you raise prices, it's collusion, that kind of thing.
yeah, or if you raise prices,
Whereas
it's taking advantage. If you have the same prices as your
That's right, yeah,
competitors, you're colluding with them and so forth. So there's this idea that the laws could be used to go after anyone, and there was no way to kind of prove you were the case wrong. I think judges by and large respect the idea of a rule of law. They don't want to be making capricious decisions, and so if you have laws that are non-objective, as Ram would analyze them, that is written such that they don't have clear meaning and that they're kind of rubber and can be used that way, if you have even if she's right about that, and I think she is about those laws, when you have a legal system populated by mostly people who are not power lusters, who aren't people who want to be running other people's lives, but who want to be interpreting and implementing laws fairly, they serve as a kind of bulwark where there are developing kind of laws and procedures and ways to regularize things that kind of cabin in their own powers, and then the powers of the people who succeed them, so that it more approximates, maybe it amounts to, some people would say, but at least it more approximates objective law that's kind of clearer what it means and what the limits are. And so one thing you might think has happened, and I think has happened in a lot of areas of life with what gets called the regulatory state, is that where laws ceded too much power to either judges or to bureaucrats, standards have gotten set by the community of such people that kind of make it more predictable and rein it in. But you could interpret that as saying that's not a problem, or you could interpret it as saying it's a problem. There are some elements in our political culture that push back against it, so that if there's a legislative failure, we don't run off the rails. We get a kind of, sort of check on it in the judicial or in the a culture of administrators. But it's fragile, and it's not as good as if the laws were written well in the first place. And you can see a kind of change in more vulnerable to quick changes. And we'll see what happens. There's now a lot of sentiment around in the administration of being more aggressive on antitrust, and in particular abandoning the consumer welfare standard. So it's a standard that makes it a lot harder to show that what someone's that a company is harming people and therefore proper subject to antitrust violation. And you have a lot of sentiment now in the Congress to, if that doesn't happen, to write laws targeting these companies. So if it's wrong, if antitrust is wrong or bad, which is, something we haven't argued here, right? The fact that it didn't spiral out of control.
Does that mean it wasn't one of the issues she should have focused on?
Yeah.
Is that the question?
I mean, I think there was a pushback on it, and the pushback had it kind of, stemmed it somewhat. But it is a kind of an interesting question when you're thinking about political analysis over time, and when you're thinking about your own time in that way. How do you understand the time you're living through? And one of the things I think for us now, trying to make sense of our own time, is thinking about past predictions and what was right and what was wrong about them. And all of us are going to have limited kens on this, particular issues and times we know. But you want to think about how special, how different is your time. Now, Wren definitely thought that the early 60s and the Kennedy administration was a particular cascading towards the awful time. And it's worth keeping in mind a lot happened quickly. So we got, a lot of people will think this was good, but we got mostly socialized medicine in America, right, under Johnson, that is Medicare. We had, and this was coming after the New Deal, so it was a big kind of change towards another large socialist program. We also had the Vietnam War and a lot of things that you might have seen as very concerning in that administration. And then in the Nixon administration, where you got the
wage and price controls.
Wage and price controls, yeah. In the 70s, you also got the starting of the EPA, and
but you
under
also got the draft.
Eventually, yeah. Oh, but and also then under Kennedy, the Kiefer-Harris amendments to the Food and Drug Act, which made the FDA regulate for effectiveness as well as for safety, and so made the process of getting drugs to market a lot more onerous and a lot less market centered. So there was a lot happening quickly in a way that hasn't really happened since, and arguably we were cascading towards something, and something stemmed it. And that's, I mean, if you look over her view over the course of time, that is what she thinks happened. She thinks it kind of, there was a bridge too far and people reacted against it in the mid-'70s, and that led to a train of presidents, a little bit under Nixon, under Ford, under Carter, under Reagan, kind of rolling things back a bit. I don't know. Shay seems to want to come in.
Yeah, I had a question on, we're evaluating these views on what are the important issues. And one thing that I would ask looking back, and I don't know enough about this time to have an answer, but not only there's the question of, okay, she said these two things, how important were these two things, but also what are the things in retrospect we would say now were the most important things going on then or about to be coming out? So, I mean, one thing that comes to mind that seems to more on the cultural side than the political side, you have the New Left and you have the sexual revolution, you have all these, and I don't know in the early 60s how evident that was coming out. So again, I'm not familiar, but and I don't know if that was actually the core issue, but what would we say, what were the core issues then? Could she have seen them? Did she miss it? Or is it really the same essential case that she made?
Yeah, part of what's remembered for this period is there's a sexual revolution starting prior to that, and importantly, civil rights. And of course, then the Vietnam War was, starting to start with this a little bit earlier. And she did write about both of those in about a year later, right? So there's an article on racism and the civil rights movement in 1963. I want to have a session where we're talking about those issues. And there's a review of Betty Friedan's The Feminist Mystique. I forget what year that is, but not too long after this, I don't think. So there are things that are on the radar, but it's not. These are the things that she's identifying as the essentials in 62, and I think it's hard to without knowing a lot about the time, put yourself back and think we don't know about what else was in the news too unless you study it. but she's definitely seeing, like, right now there's an emergency of an administration that's kind of aggressively moving on these two tracks. And
And I guess another question, which we've alluded to, but like, how do we incorporate the fact that she was a popular writer who spoke out about this and who had a following? Like, I know there's strong evidence to think that she was influential on the end of the draft, for example. So does that mean she was wrong, or does that mean she was successful?
Yeah.
So how do we? And I don't know if she had any reach on these issues, but like, is there a possibility, given what we know, that part of the scaling back that you're talking about is downstream of her work fighting these issues?
Yeah, there definitely was eventually a kind of pushback on Minnow generally, as evidenced by him being mocked in the in a sitcom. But I don't know. I mean, one thing I'd like to do as someone who sort of studies her and her work, and if I was a historian, that I would be thinking about doing, is like to try to document what actually went on. What was the sequence of popular writings and popular opinions on these issues at the time? Is she underestimating the amount of opposition that these forces are facing in 1962 when she's writing this, and there is pushback already? Or is there not, and it arises later? And if it does, due to her or due to other forces, who else is there in the world pushing on these issues? And these are, I think, really good questions.
Do we want to say anything about the unwinding of the power of the FCC?
Go ahead.
So we spoke about antitrust becoming less of a threat to business. Over time, there's the end of the fairness doctrine. There's the flourishing of conservative talk radio that's sometimes thought to be a consequence of that. And then, I mean,
I think the bigger thing
10
is,
years later, we have the internet. So
and we have cable, which is the bigger thing. So there's many more
cable's the
stations, channels.
Late 80s. I'm trying to think of when that begins.
I mean, there starts to be in the late 70s, I think, but
Cable, like CNN, cable news.
oh, well, that's later. But
That's later, yeah.
but just the fact that there are a lot more channels means that and the channels aren't broadcast through the air means that
You
it's
find
not
them in your home. Yeah.
under direct FCC regulation. But one thing we should think about is sort of like, what do we think of as the important issues today? And what I hope that we'll do on this podcast is we'll look back at some of Rand's articles and think about what she was thinking on different issues at different times. That's what we were kind of just chatting about here. But, what do we think are the issues that are big and pressing today, and that we should do episodes on, that we should be thinking about? What matters? What episodes aren't just flashes in the pan, but what issues, rather, aren't just flashes in the pan, but are indices of something changing, turning points or shifts in the culture? There's a time now where we can get this right or wrong and it'll change things. What are the fulcrums to be pushing on? And what do people think? I mean, what issues, does anyone have any thoughts? And I don't know if there's anyone on the chat online, but does anyone have any thoughts about what are the big issues today? What's the wheat and what's the chaff of what's discussed? So Shay's
I'm not actually the only one here.
there are a few others, but you are the most loquacious. So I should say part of the idea of the format with this is we've set up one seat with a microphone and a camera by it on the premise that people can be here and attending and not be seen on tape. If you don't have to be wanting to be a podcast star to be in the room, you might just want to be part of the conversation, and yet there's a seat off to the side for people to go to if they want to be online. So that's how this is turning out this way.
So the thing that seems most salient to me and scares me the most is free speech. And part of what scares me about it is that everybody's talking about it and claiming to support it and are clearly viciously opposed to it in their so-called support of free speech. Free speech to them means letting me say what I want on your platform, or letting me decide what is true and scientific versus what isn't. So that to me, if I were to choose a political issue to take up the sword on, that would be a political cultural issue, because it's not just political, it's also opposition to the very idea of people setting standards and people deciding who who to listen to and who to allow to use their platforms on a cultural level as well.
Yes, I see that as one of, if not the biggest issue today. You call it the free speech wars, or the discussions around free speech. And part of what troubles me about them is how far all the contending parties are from what I think of as the relevant principle of free speech. And we've done events at the Salem Center the last few years on this. Tara Smith and I have each given talks on it, I guess, 2 years ago, and we had a panel on free speech in education last year, and Ankar Gate gave a talk. So we've been doing stuff on it. There's Free Speech Week coming up in October, and Tara Smith is going to give another talk. But yeah, this is a big issue, and it was interestingly the way the issue is playing out in the culture today, I think, is very similar to the way it was playing out in 1962 that Rand was concerned about, and that we could see in her articles on it. So if you think about...
Could you draw that out?
Yeah, so a lot of what was going on, I don't know how much I want to go into the details of what particular controversy were. There was some issue with Alger Hiss was on a documentary, and then some NBC affiliate, I think it was whatever network was airing the documentary. Some of the affiliates didn't want to air it because of advertisers wouldn't, and there was a question, was that a violation of whose free speech and so forth. And there's also a time after which, communists were claiming that they were being persecuted when people didn't want to hire them, or were blacklisting them, or allegedly blacklisting them, and were posing as champions of free speech while defending a country, of course, in which you weren't allowed to say anything. So what is free speech? What is it, and what counts as free speech, and what would be a defense of it, and what would be against it? And one of the things that is a kind of theme running through Rand's writing on this is that you can't separate the so-called political or social rights like free speech from economic rights like property. And we could see that in the concerns about both antitrust and censorship, and the concerns about how those two things will impact one another, how they'll be combined. In the case of free speech, there's the idea of, what does free speech mean? Does free speech mean you have a right to say what you want to say? It's a right against anybody forcibly stopping you from saying it, that is, shooting you, imprisoning you, etc., for saying what they don't want you to say. And in particular, against the government doing that by jailing you for saying the wrong kind of things, or by treating you differently as a government depending on what you say. For example, giving you a radio license, a license to broadcast radio if you're going to say one kind of thing but not another, or a license to have a television station if you're going to say one thing without another. Those are what violate the rights to free speech. Why? Because they're impositions of force into the domain of who can say what. But all speech requires a place to say it, requires material means, and it's not when people are often complaining about free speech, their free speech is being violated, they're complaining that people won't give them a platform. Somebody won't invite me to speak. Someone won't have me on their radio show. YouTube won't have my program on, or they'll demonetize this show, or won't put it high up in their algorithm or whatever, since we're on YouTube right now, right? And someone else will get more views, maybe because they have YouTube will promote them over us or whatever. YouTube isn't being neutral. There's not neutrality in the content. Maybe we'll get banned even for if we say the wrong thing. We're not being given access to the platform, to the stage, to the microphone, to the broadcast network. There, it's not about is force being used to stop us from speaking. It's about, are we being sort of given or denied the material means to speech. And I have a whole talk on this up here. It's called The Right to Speech and the Value of Speaking Freely. So I don't want to kind of reiterate it, but yeah.
Can I ask you, I have two questions about, so if we're drawing a parallel between today and the time Rand's writing about these issues. So I think someone concerned about free speech today who's not Rand influenced would raise as a important difference between the two errors so one is this allegation that, well, the social media companies are in some way government agents operating, and that somehow this delegitimizes some of their speech rights. And the other is there's also a value issue today, a value of exchange of ideas. That value has been abandoned by the wider culture, and that doesn't seem to be an issue in the 60s. That exchange of ideas and discourse is still valued.
Well, I think it's easy to imagine it was valued a lot more than it was.
Than it was.
I mean, you see people now say, it's so much worse than it used to be on the news or whatever. You only hear one side of the story or whatever. That, I think, is just BS.
Mm-hmm.
It was not the case that you heard all sides of the story on the news in the 50s or the 60s or the 70s or the 80s. It was that you didn't have enough sources of information to know that there were any sides of the story other than what you were hearing. Mm-hmm. So you are, I think, worse off. We have more access to more sources of information and contrary opinions now than anyone ever in the history of humanity has had. I think it's kind of bizarre and ridiculous to think otherwise from that. But there is the question of whether people now are more censorious than they were then. Mm-hmm. People are more prone to react by saying that's beyond the pale, you shouldn't be allowed to say that, we don't want to have dealings with people who say that, and so forth. And there are certainly many issues now on which that's the case that it wasn't 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And I am concerned about a kind of growth of a new censoriousness in the kind of style of political activism, particularly on the left, but not exclusively. But it's a little, one has to think before one says it's grown so much about the fact that it's also shifted issues. Mm-hmm. There have always been some things that were taboos and people wouldn't be
you mentioned
want to talk about.
Of the communists.
Mm-hmm. So. Yeah, so it's more comfortable to be a communist now than it used to be in public, less comfortable to have anti-gay attitudes, for example. Or a racist. Yeah. But, I mean, you have pro-gay attitudes in, could you talk about someone being gay on television in 1962 and so? I don't know. I would suspect.
I would think no.
There were lots of things you couldn't say, and people just wouldn't even think of saying them. And so that's not to say that the current attitudes towards this, the current censoriousness that we're facing is good. And I think there's been a shift in a bad direction on this since the 90s. Mm-hmm. But even in the which is just when I was in college and when I was growing up, there was a kind of fantasy that things were much more free and open even in those times than they were. Having always had views that are way outside the mainstream, I've always been aware of certain things that were, toxic if you said them, and some of them I think were true. So, for example, in the 90s, it was seen as heretical to think that homosexuality was anything other than genetically caused. It was the arguments in favor of gay rights at that time were largely being made on the grounds of people are born this way. They have no control over it. It's not any kind of a choice or anything about culture. And so therefore, to discriminate against somebody on the basis of their sexuality is like discriminating them on the basis of their race, and we know that's wrong, and so forth. So at the time, I don't know when I even thought about gay marriage to be in favor of it, but, I was not that late in the game and certainly was against any kind of discrimination against gay people. I thought people have every right to be gay. But I've never thought that there was a compelling case that it was genetic. I think indeed now people don't really think it's genetic. I think it's complicated with lots of causal factors and who the hell knows. But back then, if you said people aren't born that way or I'm not convinced they're born that way or whatever, that was it was seen as a hateful or outrageous kind of thing. So there have always been things like this, and they've always been kind of faddish. I do think there's more of it now. People feel the need to be more cautious of what they say. But I don't think we're at like the worst stage ever of it. I think there's just maybe more factiousness now about it than there was. But it is, I think, a problem. And so the other thing now that's going on is the idea that like what half of the country thinks on some topics is toxic and can't be said. And it would be really good to have more historical context on that. That is, none of us now commenting on this were around, you know.
You're thinking about these sort of polls that say to ask Democrats, do people that are people that disagreeing with you immoral for their disagreement? And you know, you get 40% of Democrats and 42% of Republicans say yes. You're talking about that.
I think it might be the other way around.
Yeah,
that it's more Democrats who will say it than Republicans, but a lot of people on both sides.
Yeah.
But I mean, isn't that right? I mean, if you don't think that a fair amount of the people who disagree with you on important political issues are, you know, immoral for it, that there's some immorality on their part involved in it, I think you're not taking politics too seriously enough. But yeah, but there's the issue of there's a kind of fever pitch about it. Should they be allowed? Should people be fired or fired for their beliefs? We are in a much hotter time about that than we were when you and I were younger. I wonder where we are compared to the 60s or 70s on that.
I mean, I don't know how much.
Like people who were for or against Jim Crow, like were they like, oh, I'm happy, you know, having them over at my house for dinner, even though, you know, they have the opposite view on this?
When I was in college, you couldn't show any degree of non-hostility towards the Iraq War. Is something that strikes me as a relevant data point. So it's...
and what does it mean that you couldn't? What would happen? It was just sort of socially...
Social ostracism. I had a friend who was kind of harangued by a professor for this. I have heard from professors on campus at the time that they would face ostracism from their colleagues.
And this was what years? 2005?
2000, you know, 4, 5, 6, like the mid-aughts, yeah.
So there's, you know, questions about things in one's time always seem like crises and scandalous, and that doesn't mean that they never are. I actually think that there are particular real big threats to free speech now, but it's very hard to put them in perspective without you know, some kind of data on them and way of normalizing for it. And then the kinds of data that you get on them tend to be relatively narrow in time slices. Like we had a talk here about polls on this, but these issues the other day, but they weren't going back like 50 years. They were going back, you know, how much more heated is the issue than 10 years ago.
When these things are going on, it seems like it's this existential, like, thing. So I remember during the 2004 election, I think, I had people unfriend, like in real life, unfriend Bush voters. So.
And vice versa, and Kerry. I mean, I know people who really, you know, not quite came to blows, but didn't speak to each other over Bush versus Kerry, and you know that may seem like a much less consequential election in.
It seems like who cares?
In retrospect, well, I actually think it was.
Well, compared to Trump.
Yeah, but you might think that if Kerry had won, then Obama wouldn't have won so soon afterwards, and you might think each of, you know, the alternative history that starts, that if not Obama, then not Trump, so you can make any election seem super
if it weren't for Ralph
important.
Nader, we wouldn't. If it weren't for Ross Perot, we wouldn't have had Bill Clinton. No one would know who Hillary Clinton is. And there's a whole
But if you think that history is on a progression of some sort, right? You do think a lot of these turning points matter, and that's like one thing you want to think about is like if you're thinking about, is Bush or Kerry worse back in 2004? What were the reasons, and how do those reasons relate to what later happened with Obama? And if you were arguing about Obama and McCain and who was better or who was worse, what were the reasons given by the people who were on each side of it, and how does that relate to what would trigger something like Trump and Hillary as the competing candidates? And then so likewise. But let's shift to something on the particular issue of free speech. There are two law proposals, I think maybe we'll make our last topic. One of them is law that's actually now been passed, versions of it in Florida and here in Texas, and it's winding its way through the courts. That social media companies, I forget the exact text of the law, but they can't take off elected officials or ban things in a politically partisan way. This is something that's being pushed by Republicans, thus Florida and here in Texas, and was overturned by or was stayed by one court, and then the Texas version of it got then supported by an appellate court, and it'll be appealed up to the Supreme Court. But what do we think of this kind of law? So the argument is these things are platforms. You can't have companies that discriminate on the basis of political points of view. It's unhealthy for the democracy. It's prejudicial. It's controlling things. It's anti-free speech. For free speech, we need neutrality. Yeah. These companies are the public square, and what do we make of that?
I mean, so
I think we make more or less the same thing.
Yeah,
but
what we make of that is these are private creations, private property.
But they're so big. Who could compete with Facebook or Google? It's ridiculous to think you can.
Snapchat.
You're like,
TikTok.
there we go.
TikTok is that? What are the ones I don't even know about?
These companies are like
somebody younger than 30. Flip Scrap. That's made up. I didn't even know.
These companies are like 10, 20 years old. They're not. I mean, these laws. I take it are as anti-free speech as any law ever passed in the country has been, and I include under that like the Comstock laws and these kinds of things. We're talking about taking political control of platforms and of content policy. And the content policy can't everywhere be totally neutral on everything, so that there can be, ISIS can recruit on it, and that there can be, pornography on every platform. I mean, part of what you want to do in creating a platform is some of them allow pornography and some of them don't. There are these ridiculous companies that pretend they're free speech platforms like Parler and such, and we're a platform for free speech, but like they don't have porn on it. Well, why? Why is that? Is that not free speech? Reddit's a more free speech platform than those are. Not that I'm saying one should have pornography, but if the idea is you can say anything, well, then you should be able to say anything. But nobody wants platforms that you could say anything on, or rather, most people don't, because they want limitations towards certain kinds of discussion that they think are
valuable, productive,
a posit for what they're doing. So it can't be everything. And so then, what is it going to be? You're going to have somebody who's making decisions about what points of view have to be allowed on Twitter. ISIS recruitment is out, but the Republican Party and the Democratic Party are in. Well, what about the Green Party or the Libertarian Party? What about some kind of anarchist view? And what if who's going to make all those decisions? And what we're saying is it's not companies. It's not the people can vote with their feet and dollars and sign up for what they want and form whatever associations they want to talk about what they want. It's going to be whoever's in the FTC or FCC or whatever office it is that changes every 4 years, making those kind of decisions. That's having content czars. And I mean, I just think that's a horror. And if you think that's for free speech, or that we're in some emergency situation where the woke or something are coming for us, and the only way to save free speech is to do this, that's exactly the same argument that's been made for every anti-free speech kind of constraint. There's some special thing about this situation, which means that we have to have kind of governmental power, control speech, control this kind of sphere, make decisions about who can come in and come out, because there's some kind of emergency happening. It's always the claim, and it doesn't work. It just kind of grows and it socializes speech, right? It makes speech something that's what speech is allowed where, subject to popular collective control by who wins the presidency and who do they appoint and who therefore controls it, rather than subject to freedom of association.
What then is the...
Do you want to come over to the...
Sure.
Yeah.
As someone that's not very familiar with Ayn Rand's teachings, what then is the objectivist view on tolerance?
So what is, good question. So what do we mean by tolerance? Are we talking about the political tolerance of, I don't shoot you for saying something I don't agree with?
I don't.
Or are we talking about, we're still friends if we disagree?
I don't particularly see the distinction as a very. I see it as a continuum. So.
You see, so that's interesting. You see there being a continuum between, like, you insult my mother, so I shoot you or try to get you locked up.
Yes.
And you insult my mother, so I say, like, we're not going to be friends anymore.
I just think that if we're going to make a distinction, we might, it might take take away the potency of the problem of defining tolerance within a given philosophical ideology or system.
But I don't think tolerance as such means very much. That is, it's a kind of thing that can be defined positively or negatively. I think it includes too many different things. What is it to tolerate something? It's to think it's wrong, but still allow for it, right? And when should you allow for things you think are wrong? Well, I don't think there's a general answer to that. It depends on what we mean by allowing for. Like, if what we mean by allowing for is you don't shoot the person, well, then I think you don't have any right to shoot the person in the first place. So you should tolerate everything in that sense. But if what we mean is you're going to continue to associate with them, you're going to continue to hire them, deal with them, support them, promote them, whatever it is, then I think it's going to be a really nuanced question having to do with your particular values, the particular relationship. Why are you in the relationship? I mean, suppose, are we talking about, like, are you going to marry someone and they think some things that you think are horrible, and or are we talking about you're going to continue to buy groceries from them? But I'm more interested in this idea that you don't think that there's a hard line between, if you don't think there's a hard line between the two kind of cases I started with, you say something I regard as outrageous, and so I want to lock you up, and you say something I regard as outrageous, so I don't want to be your friend anymore, or I don't want to hire you anymore.
I think that to approach the problem, it might be helpful to at first consider all actions together,
but I think,
without any distinction among the actions, and then see what tolerance of an action would be. And then maybe later we might postulate some distinctions among the actions.
Why is that way of coming at it helpful, do you think?
I don't know. I'm the one asking what tolerance means within the objectivist lens. So maybe this is where you might bring your own distinctions. I'm open to hearing it out.
Is that papers over this kind of fundamental divide in how we deal with people. There's a fundamental difference between dealing with people voluntarily and dealing with them by force.
Mm-hmm.
And that divide is a kind of huge chasm that, or bright line, let's say, that's got to be present any time that we're thinking about interacting with people at all. Are we talking about voluntary interactions, or are we talking about force, violence, compulsion? And are we talking about a transaction between us, or are we talking about my, threatening to kill you? Are we talking about a trade, or are we talking about compelling people? And I think those are kind of the two opposite ways of dealing with people, by persuasion and by force. And I don't think there are very many principles that bridge that gap.
Okay, so
if we're talking about compulsion, I don't have the right to compel you. Unless you're compelling me, I don't have the right to exercise force against you unless you're exercising it against me. If we're not talking about compulsion, and we're talking about you and I disagree about something, and should I continue to hire you, be friends with you, whatever the thing might be, right? Then I think it's going to depend on, well, what is the disagreement? How big is it? What kind of relationship do we have to begin with? And there's going to be like a lot of context and nuance in that answer. But it's basically, in effect, what kind of terms can we come to that are mutually beneficial by both of our own judgments, despite our having some what we both might see as an important disagreement. But the ability for people to organize that way, that is freely and voluntarily, depends on the fact that none of us is going to, break out the saber. And it's breaking out the saber if what I try to do is, smite you because you say the wrong thing. And so I think the kind of fundamental question is there force involved in the exchange or not? And then if there isn't, then there's one whole set of questions that comes in. And if there is, I think it's wrong because of the force.
We have a YouTube question. I don't know if we can answer this. I can't answer it. So Ian asks, have either of us read Jonathan Rauch's Constitution of Knowledge? So I have not.
Haven't yet, but it's on my list of things to read because it seems really interesting. And it came up in the talk. I wasn't at the talk, but at the Salem Center last week on what the Kaufman was calling cultural Marxism,
cultural socialism.
Socialism, rather, yeah. So I haven't read it yet, but it's on my list as something
Seems to be very
interesting.
influential amongst people who are concerned about the questions we're
And I
discussing.
think from what I've read some reviews of it and such, and I think it is raising some, I don't want to say much without having read it, but the kind of issues of what kinds of institutions do we want? And here we don't just mean governmental institutions, but but including governmental institutions, respect for procedure. And the kind of respect for procedures is part of what I alluded to earlier when talking about what things served as checks on antitrust and so forth. And one of the things that you might think is happening now in the world is that we're having an erosion of respect for procedure. That was maybe it was overly fetishized at one point. Maybe it's now being overly vilified. You might think that a lot of the Trump movement on the right is a kind of disrespectful, contemptuous of bureaucrats, procedures, guardrails, etc. And you might think a lot of the action now wokeism is similarly so disrespectful. And I do think that that's a big part of what's going on with the kind of contemporary expert. But I don't want to comment specifically on that book without having read it. I just have a kind of sense of what it's about. But I do, now that we're on the topic of the Kaufman talk, the cultural socialism talk, I want to mention another law that was proposed there. This isn't a law that I think is actually on the books or is being considered somewhere, but it's a kind of thing that he proposed, which is, in effect, making political positions in a protected class for hiring and firing. So this is on Juan's topic of another toleration issue. Should we make it illegal to hire or fire someone because of their political position? Wouldn't that, a lot of people feel uncomfortable, they feel threatened if they let it known what their political views are. And isn't this a solution to that?
I mean, I don't think there. So as far as legally, I don't think there should be any protected classes for hiring and firing. So we can have a moral perspective on that, but as far as the state's concerned,
And this is my view too, but we should note how far out on a limb you and I are saying. So we're saying that the landmark 1964 legislation that ended Jim Crow is wrong, at least on this point, right? So that law had several provisions. One was knocking down state laws that enforced segregation, but the other was saying that you couldn't hire or fire based on race
and
gender. Or creed. But creed is already, they're meaning religious creed, you couldn't say only hire Protestants or something, is already hiring or firing based on belief.
Closer to belief than race. Yeah.
And so if we have that, you might as well have you can't hire or fire based on political party. It's the same kind of idea. But I think it's gross and a terrible violation of free speech and freedom of association.
And this connects free speech back to the material implications or instantiations of it. So one of the way you might exercise your speech is I don't want to associate with communists
Or fascists.
Or Nazis or
I don't want to bake cakes for people whose weddings I disapprove of. Say some cake bakers, right? And this went up to the Supreme Court. Yeah, I mean, I think this is an important issue, and the idea that we should expand this protective class rather than contract it, I think is really wrong. I think this is something we really should be moving back against, moving
away
back from if we value free speech and freedom of association. And I think it transparently hasn't worked. I mean, it's not like as a result of it,
There's no
you know,
more
there's-
racism anymore.
There's no
right?
more
Yeah.
racism or sexism in workplaces. I mean, the people who support these kinds of laws, will, are eloquent on the topic of the
Continuing
continuation
injustices
of racism, and I think are often right about it. I don't think every claim of it is right, but I think it's not make believe that these things persist. And I suspect, although I don't know how to prove this, I would like to see kind of like empirical sociology work on this. But I suspect that these laws actually retard the coming up of creative solutions that would create more integrated and diverse workplaces, rather than having ever helped them. I suspect that that's their history, and I have reasons for thinking it, but I don't know how to prove it. So that's a big topic for another.
I mean, so I think this is, I agree that the fundamental question is what should be legal and not, but I think this is a good opportunity to go back to what you were saying earlier, Greg, about like when it is voluntary. In that context, it really depends on the specific situation. So like Mike works at the Ayn Rand Institute, and if they hired for somebody writing content for their newsletter, hired somebody who's a Democrat, right? That would be a big deal. That could not work for what they're trying to do.
Or a Republican, for that matter.
Right,
probably.
sure. Yeah, I didn't mean to choose one side over other. Yeah, that would be that would be antithetical to their values, their goals, their mission of what they're trying to do with the organization. Whereas, if I'm hiring software engineers for my team, I mean, it does actually slightly impact my evaluation of somebody to know their political views, and if their political views I think are worse than others, that does make me think a little bit less of them. But in the context that I'm hiring them for, it's not even close to relevant for what I'm doing unless I'm working on a political situation or I'm worried about. So I'd be less worried about like party affiliation, more worried about, are you affiliated with one of the groups that tends to make productive work impossible at certain stages based on if certain issues arise. So I might care about different things hiring in that context than you guys would in whatever context you're hiring for.
So I mentioned before, I'll kind of advertise for it now, a talk that's on our channel that I gave back in 2020 after I recently had a propane tank explode at me. So I look a little funny in it. But on the right to free speech versus the value of speaking freely. And I talked a lot about that there, like the reasons to favor maximally inclusive policies for who you'll deal with in many circumstances, and how one should try to negotiate those kind of situations. But yeah, I think that's right. There's a lot of reason to want to not restrict the people one's willing to deal with to people who are right about everything in one's own judgment. You're just not going to find enough people, and you're going to exclude lots of people who, even if you're right about all the issues that you're selecting for, who's right on, you're going to exclude a lot of people who, despite that wrongness, have real value to offer on the topics for which you're hiring. But for each kind of enterprise, for each kind of position, for each kind of common endeavor, there are going to be certain non-negotiable things. We have to agree on this in order to be able to do it. And it's going to be very, very organization to organization, job to job, which thing it's going to be.
Right. And there are people who I think are completely right philosophically and are maybe not on a skill basis, but I think have the wrong views on how programming should work.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't hire them on that basis, even though, one thing that you said that I think is important to really emphasize is that the issue is not so much like, it's partly how do I evaluate this person morally? That's often very relevant. But it's the fundamental is what will help me achieve what I want to achieve. And so if somebody's a perfectly good person, you don't think they did anything wrong, and yet they're not furthering your mission, that should be that should set the standard for how you evaluate.
But the question is there a certain kind of, you're wronging someone or you're doing something wrong. You're somehow perverting the process if you let certain kinds of considerations come into play.
I think only to the extent that it undermines your mission, not to the extent that I don't think there are overriding.
Well, but it might be the case that there are kinds of principles about things that it will necessarily
to do based on race, no matter what, right?
It will necessarily undermine any valid mission.
Right. Yeah.
Although even there, I don't think it's exactly true because
Makeup companies.
Casting.
casting, makeup country, or suppose, I mean, think about the issues with college admissions, right? So right now there's cases going up at the Supreme Court about race in admissions, and there's a lot of thought that they'll overturn affirmative action, and overturn the use of race in hiring.
College admission.
In college admissions on the grounds that it's discriminatory against Asians and others. But there's something sort of weird about how we think about college admissions as this kind of special case of there's this these spots at the school that have to be doled out to the best either to the best applicants, and then maybe by having racial preferences or alumni preferences or other preferences, we are distorting or perverting that, and that's the kind of set of questions. But I mean, doesn't it really matter a lot what each school's mission is? I mean, maybe you have a school that their goal is we want to create in a few-year term the best engineers. What we're focused on in like who we admit and what our admissions criteria is like we don't look more ahead than 4 years from now, and what we want is the best class of engineers 4 years from now, and we're going to do everything we can once you get here to train you to be an engineer. And what our admission criteria is like how likely do we think we are to be able to make you a fantastic engineer? And that's one way you might do your admissions. But another, you might have a school that specializes in taking people from one place to another place, or to catering to a certain kind of population, or a school that sees its mission like religious schools do, as advancing a certain kind of ideology in the world or a certain set of goals in the
Think
world.
of like a historically black college.
Or a historically black college, for example.
So, I mean, I think there's legitimacy to those in principle, but do you actually think that's what's going on with these policies that are being challenged? That there's a legitimate purpose
and I
that
think
is
it's
being
also. I mean, I hope the law gets struck down in the Supreme Court, or I hope the challenges are upheld. Largely because I think these now currently all the colleges are basically federal funds, and they're functioning as parts of a system that doles out education to people. But if we imagine what a real kind of educational establishment or educational market would be like for higher education that was entirely on a free market voluntary association principles, I think it would look really different, and we wouldn't think of the schools as I think the way Harvard is thought of now is like as a kind of public resource that has a duty to the public at whole to admit people in the way that's best for the future of the republic or future of the society or something like that. And then there's a lot of posturing about, well, what is that way? Is it to admit in a race-neutral way or a race-conscious way or a class-conscious way, or what way is it? But I think that whole way of looking at Harvard as though it's ours rather than Harvard's, ours of the societies, and every other school looking at it that way, is really a mistake. It shouldn't be looked at that way. But of course, I think they have to be looked at that way in a context where all the money is coming from the government to it. And of course, state schools have to be looked at that way. So I think it's a kind of function of the fact that education is socialized.
But given that funding is coming from the government, presumably that is established under a certain statute for certain purposes, and shouldn't that set the goal?
Yeah.
Not whatever happens to be currently politically expedient, but
I think so, yes.
Okay.
And that's how I view it, given that it is set up that way.
Right.
But I think there's a kind of broader, the very fact that all of this is done with public funds kind of perverts the whole way that we're thinking about the education space. And I think like when you really think about whether it's education or employers or whatever other space we're thinking about, these kind of laws about hiring via association, whatever, when you don't think of them as owned by the public for the sake of serving the public good, but associations of people who have their own purposes, which may be idiosyncratic or so forth, and who knows what their particular missions are. You really have to respect the fact that there might be all kinds of different things that different organizations ought to or oughtn't take into account in their decisions, including what kind of social change goals they may have, or other kinds of goals they may have, and what their missions might be. And if you can get a completely voluntary association of people aligned on those kind of policy perspectives, on those kinds of choices, then I think it's no business of anybody else to interpose with force to stop them. And if you think that their views are wrong, as some of them may be, you have lots of means at your disposal to fight them, compete with them, criticize them, boycott them, etc.
Ignore them.
Ignore them. And that goes back to the kind of fundamental difference between dealing with people by force and persuasion. We've been going for quite a while now, having started late. We've gone about, I think, 90 minutes since we started.
I think so.
Right? So I think we're at a kind of stopping point. We're going to try to do these regularly. I'm not sure how regularly. I want to see how much interest there is, and we're going to try to have it with more specific topics. We'll either have all read something that we're going to discuss in advance, or there'll be something in the news. This was a little more free form in part because of the experiment of could we even get it going, and because we wanted to kind of introduce a little bit what we're going to talk about. So I hope people enjoyed the talk. Leave comments on YouTube and so forth. We're going to make a podcast channel of this, we think, once we have a couple of them, and have them available through podcast catchers. And happy choosing of your issues for future ones, and wish us success in choosing good ones. And suggest some in the comments, things you'd like to hear thought through and talk through.